You are one of the leading experts in ground-penetrating radar.
I think many of those claims that have been circulating out there on the internet were not actually made in the study. They were made after the study. And by the way, I should let you know, I was one of the peer reviewers on that original article that was published. These appear to be really smart folks that are doing some sophisticated things, and I like their approach, but I can't comment on how they used all of these mind-numbing equations to get to what they're doing. It seems to me to be very, very implausible that you could get radar waves from whatever source to go to that depth. I could do some calculations on how hot it would be down 2,000 feet under the ground, but for ancient people to have done such a thing seems not only a little bit crazy, but inconceivable to me. So would I expect there to be structures under the pyramid? The answer is yeah, this is what people do. People have special places that are of importance, and those could involve constructed buildings or even tunnels or caves or something like that that were constructed, and then over time the elite or some authority decided to build the pyramids on top of what was already considered a special or sacred spot. So it makes perfect sense to me to find something like that. Listen, I don't want to critique the authors on misinterpretation. I would prefer to say that I don't understand their interpretive methods.
Now, since we're talking a lot today about how we use advanced technology to explore what's beneath the surface, it's a good time to mention something that's just as important. The technology that we use to protect what's above the surface, your personal data. And that's where the sponsor of today's video comes in, Aura. The reality is your data is floating around in places you've never expected. Companies are buying and selling your name, address, phone number, even your social security number like it's just another commodity. In the past, I used to get calls from random companies and I used to wonder how on earth they got my number. But after using Aura, that all became a thing of the past. Because they track billions of data points across dark web marketplaces, public records, and data broker sites. The second your information is found, you'll get an alert in real time through their all-in-one app, which also includes a built-in VPN with military-grade encryption to protect your browsing, a password manager to generate and securely store strong passwords, real-time financial fraud alerts so you're never caught off guard, and up to $5 million in identity theft insurance, so in case something goes wrong, you're always covered. With data breaches happening all the time, it's worth taking a look. Just head over to aura.com/historyleaks or click the link in the description to try Aura free for 14 days and find out if your information is already out there. And again, if you've been thinking about upgrading your cybersecurity and you want something simple that does it all, Aura is a great solution, and you can use my link to start your 14-day free trial today. Stay safe online, and now back to the video. You are one of the leading experts in ground-penetrating radar. You've written many books on the subject, and I think you're one of the best people to help us make sense of this story that came out a few weeks ago of this study that claimed to have detected some underground structures beneath the Khafre pyramid in Giza. But before we get into that, if you could just tell the viewers a little bit about your background and what exactly GPR is in archaeology.
I got into this in the late 1980s when I was a graduate student, and I was confronted with an archaeological problem of how do we look below the ground and map what's there without having to do detailed and complicated excavations. And so at the time, this technique we now know as ground penetrating radar had just been invented. And most of your viewers are probably too young to remember days before there were even CDs, but this was before CDs. So there was no digital anything. It was really old, super old school kind of stuff. And somebody told me about this method that had just been invented where you take a radar antenna, and instead of pointing the radar antenna up in the sky to look for airplanes or ships at sea or whatever, you point the antenna down in the ground and you create pulses of radar waves, which are electromagnetic waves, which are exactly the same as waves that we used to call radio waves. They're now in roughly the same frequency as cell phones or mobile phones. It's that spectrum of the electromagnetic spectrum. And you create these pulses of waves, we'll just call them radar waves from now on, and point them down into the ground. And what people started to appreciate is that radar waves will actually penetrate the ground. And people long had understood that radar waves will move in the air or in space at the speed of light, and they'll travel to infinity. They'll just go forever. But what they started to appreciate, and what I started to learn, was that as soon as radar waves go into the ground, they slow down, and every time they hit some sort of a boundary in the ground, some of those waves are reflected back to the surface and can be recorded. And that became very important because if you could measure the time between when you sent a wave from the surface, when it went down into the ground and reflected off something and came back, you could measure that in time. And if you understood the speed of that radar wave, you could measure depth.
Wow.
And this I should have remembered from high school physics. Distance equals rate times time. If you have time and you have rate or velocity or speed, you can get distance or depth. And so we started to calibrate these reflections that were going into the ground and calibrate them for speed, and we got depth. And if all of a sudden you got depth in the ground, you can begin to do some very sophisticated things that we just started to appreciate, and that is that if you move a radar antenna along the surface of the ground and continuously pulse it with radar waves in the ground, you get hundreds of thousands of reflections will come back up to the surface at various depths in the ground, and if you measure their time, you can get a two-dimensional picture of what's in the ground. And wow, I saw these two-dimensional radar pictures of the ground, and I thought I can relate to that because in my previous career I had been in oil and gas exploration, and we were doing the same things in oil and gas, except we were using sound waves or sonic waves, and we were looking miles below the ground, but they're just waves, the same kind of waves. So I understood waves in the ground, but I had never appreciated that you could do the same thing in a much shallower part of the ground by using radio waves.
Okay.
So that's how I got into it, and I used it at a Mayan site in El Salvador for my doctoral dissertation and was able to map this buried Mayan village that was as deep as 5 meters in the ground and be able to reconstruct the whole village and the landscape before we dug anything up. So that was my first encounter with ground penetrating radar.
And what kind of things did you discover in, for example, in the Mayan site or some other sites that you've looked at? Are they usually burial sites? Are they tombs? What kind of things are we talking about?
Yeah. I don't like tombs and burial sites. I've been involved in so many tombs and burial sites, and as soon as you get involved with the dead, it brings on a whole new emotional argument that people are very, very strong in their opinions about. And I've gotten involved in way too many tomb and burial site things that I could tell you terrible stories about, that I get involved in emotional arguments. So I've done it, and I don't do it anymore. But in my Central American site, I was mapping the individual houses that were standing, and you could see rooms in the houses. You could see a plaza out in front of the village. There were a variety of other features, including cornfields, actually. You could actually see the ridges and furrows in where their cornfields were. It was excavated and all confirmed. It was a spectacular, really beautiful site. I like to think of it as the Pompeii of the Western Hemisphere because it was a Mayan village buried in volcanic ash, much like Pompeii was in Italy. It's called Surin in the country of El Salvador.
El Salvador, where you okay?
And so that's where I first started working. And then I published it, and people started to appreciate what was going on with ground penetrating radar and how it could be useful. And I was very fortunate to be asked to get involved in all kinds of other projects. So I went to Petra, the famous site in Jordan, and studied all kinds of buried Roman buildings and temples and all kinds of stuff at Petra. That was in the late 90s. I did that. Anyway, I got involved in all kinds of stuff all over the world. I've been all over the world. I've been in every continent except Antarctica.
Amazing.
Doing archaeological stuff. So I've been very, very fortunate in my career to have been invited along on new and different projects that other people come up with the money for. That's even better. They're the ones that raise the money, and they ask me to be involved in their projects. So I've been very fortunate to have gotten involved in hundreds of projects.
Amazing. Okay. So you have a lot of experience in this field. So could you explain the difference between in the study that it was published back in 2022 from these Italian researchers? They use something called SAR. Is that something you've come across before? And could you explain the difference between that and GPR?
Yeah, sure. And by the way, I should let you know, I was one of the peer reviewers on that original article that was published.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So I have kind of a vested interest in what they were doing. And when that article was presented to me to review for publication, you and our listeners should be aware that I actually said that I liked the techniques that these researchers were using and that I understood what they were doing. And they were not only using SAR, which stands for synthetic aperture radar, which is a little bit different than ground penetrating radar, but it still uses radar waves. And they were also using acoustic techniques, which I understood also from my previous background, which was sound waves. Mm-hmm. And so in my original review of that article, I wrote the editor of the journal and I said, I think these folks are really on to something interesting and I encourage it and I approve of their methods, but I don't understand their interpretation.
Yeah.
And I wrote the editor back on that, and I said, you're going to need to get another reviewer to comment on their interpretations, which I can't comment on because they were using all kinds of extraordinarily complicated equations. And if you've looked at their original article, you should do it. Yeah. It's mind numbing with regards to the mathematics involved.
Yeah, I stopped reading the.
Yeah, most people stop when they get to the equations. That's what most people do is they stop, and I did too. I stopped and I wrote the editor of the journal back and I said, these appear to be really smart folks that are doing some sophisticated things, and I like their approach, but I can't comment on how they used all of these mind-numbing equations to get to what they're doing.
Yeah. So
I suggest you go to the authors or have somebody that understands all this review their techniques. And to tell you the truth, I'm not sure if they did or not because the final article that I saw still had all those equations in it, and so I can't speak to their interpretations. Okay. I can speak to the claims that have been made by someone, and I'm not sure who's making all these claims. I'm getting all kinds of emails, by the way, from people all over the world asking me to comment on their claims. And so, because I'm one of the original reviewers in the article, I'm somewhat hesitant. I can't critique them on their methods at all,
Yeah.
because I originally reviewed the articles and I said their methods are sound.
Yeah.
But some of the more outlandish claims that I'm not sure who's making these claims. As soon as this stuff goes out into the cyber world, all kinds of people get involved, and I've heard some really, really crazy stuff about a whole lost city that goes 6,500 feet below the surface, and I've heard other claims that this city under the pyramids is 35,000 years old, and I mean these are crazy kind of claims.
Yeah. A little bit far-fetched, exaggeration.
Yeah. And and I saw one YouTube video or something that somebody sent me that claimed that had something to do with Death Stars, and I don't know, maybe aliens are involved or something. And as soon as we get into stuff like that, I just have to say, stop, everybody. Let's go back to the original information and talk about what appears to be plausible and what is crazy people on social media talking about. So anyway, I don't know if that helps at all. I just can't. I've got so many brain cells to devote to this project, and as soon as I start talking about Death Stars and aliens, I'm running out of brain cells.
That's outlandish. So, and let's look at some of the claims that I can't say were in the study specifically, but that were reported to be in the study. Was that there's a structure that goes down 2,100 feet under the ground, and their SAR detected something, that deep. And what do you make of that?
I have problems with that. And the big problem is that nobody has commented on yet is that if you go 2,100 feet below the ground surface, I could do some calculations, I haven't done it right now, but the temperature at the bottom of that presumably excavated shaft would be so hot that humans could barely withstand the heat. And I did a little research on this a few days ago and looked at the deepest mine shafts in the world.
Yeah.
And there are some in South Africa in gold mines that go down 4,000 feet or so. Wow. And it's 160 degrees Fahrenheit down in the bottom of that shaft.
Yeah.
And that's hot. And humans that go down there have to wear special kind of ice pack clothing just to survive down there. And so, I don't know, I could do some calculations on how hot it would be down 2,000 feet under the ground, but for ancient people to have done such a thing seems not only a little bit crazy, but a lot crazy, but inconceivable to me. So I just, the depth alone of that purported claim is a little much. Now, let's get back to the radar. Radar waves, when they go through the ground, do something called attenuate. And attenuate just means that the ground destroys the wave. And it destroys the wave because an electromagnetic wave is an electrical wave that's oscillating, and perpendicular to it is a magnetic wave. And as long as the electrical wave and the magnetic wave continue to oscillate, that wave will continue to travel and propagate in the ground. But the problem is that the ground is electrically conductive. And as soon as you have an electrically conductive ground, it will take the electrical wave that's oscillating and conduct it away. And as soon as the electrical wave is conducted away, the magnetic wave can no longer oscillate, and the electromagnetic wave will attenuate. Now, I have collected radar in areas where I actually got 12 meters of penetration in the ground, and I thought I'd set the world's record. I don't know if there's such statistics kept, but in my world, I thought, wow, is that deep? Yeah. And so we're talking in that case, maybe 30 feet down at most, something like that. And so to get 1,000 feet down, I don't care whether it's synthetic aperture radar or a pulsed radar from my radar system, it's still radar waves, and you're still confronted with the same problem, and that is the ground becomes electrically conductive.
Yeah.
And limestone, which is what bedrock is in this part of Egypt, is really, really good for transmitting radar waves. And I've transmitted radar waves quite deep in limestone. And I'm sure that they got deep penetration with limestone. And if the pyramid structure itself is manufactured from limestone, which it is, you can get radar waves to penetrate in the pyramid itself. But it seems to me to be very, very implausible that you could get radar waves from whatever source to go to that depth.
Yeah. And also, I think the interior of the pyramid is made with granite, which is even denser than...
Yeah, and the density doesn't matter so much. It's the electrical conductivity. And granite's good for radar penetration too, so okay. That doesn't concern me much. So I'm all for supporting the idea that radar waves will penetrate potentially through the pyramid, and the longer the wavelengths, the deeper they will penetrate. And I've heard about really long wavelength radar waves that can go 300 meters in the ground. Some of them from satellites that have looked through the desert sands in the Arabian Peninsula and looked 200 and 300 meters in the ground with extremely long wavelength waves. They've done the same on the planet Mars, by the way, too, and they've done it, looked at radar waves through the sand in Mars, and they're getting quite deep penetration, but they're really long wavelengths, and the longer the wavelength, the lower the resolution of whatever it is you're going to reflect off of. So I could do some calculations if I knew the exact wavelengths and figure out what they could resolve. Mm-hmm. But I suspect with the longer wavelength, with deeper penetration, the resolution is going to be the size of a city bus instead of a small car. And with the kind of radar waves I look at, I'm lucky to find things smaller than about a football or a basketball or something like that. So anyway, wavelength and resolution are important. And with synthetic aperture radar and long wavelengths, you could potentially get that deep. And so, but I mean, not 2,000 feet now, but you could potentially get a few tens of meters. And that potentially would be enough to produce images that would be somewhat crude and low resolution of images of structures or caverns underneath the pyramid. So I think that's potential.
Yeah.
I haven't yet seen any interpretations that take that data set and make that conclusion that I'm satisfied with, but I think it's plausible.
So let's say maybe they misinterpreted something maybe potentially they may have detected something there, what are the possibilities in your mind that it could be that they're picking up?
Oh, I think it's highly plausible. Listen, I don't want to critique the authors on misinterpretation. I would prefer to say that I don't understand their interpretive methods. Can we be fair that way? And just because I don't want to accuse them of misinterpretation, but I will say that if their methods have been reviewed by others who understand how they did it, and if those methods show that there are structures under the pyramid, it would not surprise me at all, because I've looked at pyramids and other mound structures that humans build around the world, and in fact, in on my hemisphere, the Mayans and other cultures in Central America often built pyramids and structures of that sort on top of very special places. And some of the more famous Mayan pyramids and the famous pyramids of Teotihuacan, north of Mexico City, largest pyramids in North America, were built on top of caves. And those caves were modified. People went into them. They used them for ritual activity. It was where they buried special people. In their religion, those caves were entrances to the underworld that had religious significance, and they built their pyramids directly on top of those important features. And I've studied mounds in Australia, for instance, and I've published on this, and those mounds, they're much smaller than pyramids in Egypt, but they're nonetheless they're mounds. And what I found out there was that the mounds were built on top of places where a lot of really hot fires had been constructed previous to building these features on top of them. And my interpretation was that these were special places on the landscape where cremation rituals and maybe feasting activities along with the burial of the dead occurred, and then over time mounds were built on top of them, like we can call them small pyramids. And I found the burials of humans using ground penetrating radar in different layers of these as they were constructed over time. But the important part there is that they were constructed on top of a place that was already considered special in some way. And so your question about would I expect there to be structures under the pyramid? The answer is yeah, this is what people do. People have special places that are of importance, and those could involve constructed buildings or even tunnels or caves or something like that that were constructed. And then over time, the elite or some authority decided to build the pyramids on top of what was already considered a special or sacred spot. So it makes perfect sense to me to find something like that.
Yeah.
By the way, I think many of those claims that have been circulating out there on the internet were not actually made in the study. They were made after the study, and they may not have been made by the actual authors of the study. So all kinds of people are making all kinds of claims, and I can't keep up with it. Yeah. And my life is too short to keep up with the claims.
Yeah. What about did you see in the study that they mentioned there were some vibrations that they detected?
Well, that could have been sonic vibrations, sound vibrations. Mm-hmm. I'm speculating here because I don't really understand what that means. Because vibrations is kind of a vague word. Vibrations just means something changing in some way, its amplitude or its frequency or something of that sort. And I suspect that meant Now, this is very speculative on my part, but I know that the authors of that study also used acoustic waves. And if you put acoustic waves, which are sound waves, they will travel quite readily into a pyramid. And I'm purely guessing now, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if you get acoustic waves that get inside a void space and then bing, 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 echo back and forth.
Right.
Before they're finally transmitted back to whatever the receiver is that is recording them. And by the way, radar waves do that too. So you could say that radar waves will vibrate. Did you use the word vibrate? Vibrate.
Vibrations. Yeah.
Yeah, vibrations. And so radar waves do that too. Sound waves do that. They bounce around every time they find a boundary to reflect off of. They tend to reflect multiple times, and that is recorded as what you and I in common parlance would call vibrations.
You're right. Yeah.
So sure, yeah, it happens.
Okay. And is it true that they used 2 satellites in this study?
Yeah, sorry, I can't speak to the satellites. The satellites must have been something that they did after I reviewed the original work. Okay. Or maybe they used the satellites to locate things in space, like global positioning systems or something.
So I wanted to ask you, what do you think this is going to lead to? Do you think this is going to lead to anything like materialize in terms of excavations, to something further? Or?
I doubt it. The Egyptian authorities are not going to want people digging holes in pyramids to test ideas. The Egyptian authorities that I am friendly with, I'm not actually that friendly with them, but the Egyptian authorities I know would not be amenable to having people dig holes in the pyramids to test these kinds of ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. The most
this is going to remain in the speculative realm. Let's just put it that way. And it's kind of fun, and it gets people excited. And I'm sorry to be such a wet blanket about this. I mean, I'd love to be able to talk about Death Stars and aliens and things like that, but my scientific brain will not allow me to do that. And I don't mind. I'm not begrudging anybody a little talk about science, but I'm maybe not that much fun to talk about, because the fun people want to talk about spiral staircases to 2,000 feet and ancient aliens or whatever. It's not a subject I like to talk about. Yeah.
No, I respect that.
So I'm no fun at all. I get it. I'm really no fun.
It was very interesting, and thank you for explaining all about GPR and SAR and all of the actual science behind this. I think that's the most important thing here. So.
Well, by the way, the reason, getting back to my original review of that article back in 2021, I think was when it was written, was that I recommended that somebody else comment on the interpretations, but I also recommended that if the interpretations seem plausible, that they should publish it. Because by publishing these kind of things, even if later on it turns out to be bogus of some sort or has flaws or something, at least it's out there in the public record, and it will stimulate other people to look at this and try these kinds of things also. And so I think that's how science is done. I don't think we should shut down these kinds of things. And I've had somebody say, that the publishing group that published that original article needs to retract it. It's all bogus. And I'm not in favor of that.
Yeah.
I'm not in favor of squelching scientific work. Even if it later on proves to be less supported than the original authors, it's letting other people look at their data and their methods and build upon what other people have done, and let's try something new. That's how science advances, and so I'm completely in favor of that.
Yeah. Is there anything that you'd like to, where can people find out more about your work and follow?
Oh, they can just look me up on the internet. If you just search, my website is gpr-archaeology.com.
Okay.
And they can look at my website. They can read one of my books if they have trouble sleeping at night. It's really, really good for insomnia, I've heard. There's all kinds of, there's more information on there than anybody would ever care about.
Okay. Perfect.
Which is probably how you found me too. Did you look me up?
I came across you in all these news articles. They tend to like copy paste each other's work.
Yeah.
So your name is mentioned in all, like, so many news articles reporting on this story. And so I just Googled your name. I found your website. It has all this information about GPR in archaeology.
Yeah, well, that's me. That's what I do. And it's nice to have somebody care. So even though my name has been used in vain a great deal, I'm sure it's okay. As somebody said one time, an American said one time, that all publicity is good publicity as long as they spell your name right.
It's good advice. Well,
I don't know if that's true or not, but that's fine. I don't. It's all good.
No, that's definitely true. So, no, thank you, Dr. Conyers.
It's been my pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for watching. If you liked that video, please consider subscribing, leave a like, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.